Thank you, Maggie and Danny. Well, we've got a chance to have some questions and comments, and the first comment is actually going to come from one of the co-authors of one of the chapters. Danielle? This is rigged, right? We've planned this. Yeah, so whatever you'd like to do. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Paul. Just briefly, I was asked to just give a little bit of context, particularly on the Zambia chapter. And I think more broadly, I think what's really nice about this book is it adds a lot of conceptual rigor to a concept that's bandied about a lot, structural change, and even forcing the authors to standardize their data to measure this concept in a rigorous way across countries. I think the pattern that both Maggie and Danny have been discussing about the structural change being noticeable, but a lot of it being in kind of informal manufacturing or informal services is really relevant not for development trajectories, but also for political trajectories. And we saw this very clearly in the Zambia case, though I think it does apply more broadly to some of the other cases in the collection. So just briefly, I mean, what happened in Zambia, as Maggie showed, was the 1990s were really a period of deindustrialization, deurbanization with structural adjustment programs and the closure of the mines. You saw a lot of people moving back into rural areas, and that's where you saw that kind of negative structural change that Maggie showed on one of our graphics. And then due to a number of policies that we document in our chapter, during the period of the 2000s to 2010, you saw a resurgence of growth in Zambia. You saw a lot of structural change being driven by a small increase in employment in high-valued sectors such as construction, financing, and communications, but most of the employment growth was in trade, and predominantly informal, vulnerable, and pretty poorly paid trade. And it was predominantly in urban sectors as well, because you had a re-urbanization back to urban areas with a kind of rise of the copper prices in the 2000s. And so what did this really mean beyond just the kind of development trajectory you saw was that there was also a really important political shift in Zambia. And what you saw was that the political party that oversaw this growth, the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, was really credited with huge levels of economic growth during the 2000s. And you saw it evidenced in gleaming shopping malls in the capital of Lusaka, or the rise of mortgage finance, the rise of hotels in the capital. But in successive elections throughout the 2000s, increasingly your urban informal traders continuously and in larger and larger numbers kept trying to vote out the MMD and continuously supporting the opposition party, the Patriotic Front, until, for those of you who are aware, in 2011, the Patriotic Front was finally elected into office. And I think what this really shows is this paradox of economic growth coinciding with a decreasing popularity for the political party that oversees this economic growth. And it really, I think, highlights why peering into these drivers of structural change is really important. Where is the growth coming from? Which sectors? Which employment sectors? And I think, I suspect that this pattern that's been seen on the structural change side moving into informal manufacturing or kind of more kind of vulnerable but higher productivity jobs in urban retail trade and urban services partially accounts for a broader pattern, political pattern that we see at least in the African case, where you're not just seeing rural-urban differentiation and partisan affiliations, but you even see intra-urban differentiation between the urban poor often being supportive more of opposition parties, while the middle class or upper class more supportive of incumbents. So even when you're having these periods of high economic growth, there's a substantial share of the population feeling that they're still losing out. Thanks.
Very much, Danielle. Now that's one of the strengths of the book, is the set of case studies that are there that provide a lot of detail as to what was happening in these countries. So maybe Danny, Maggie, could you sit at the table in the front, and I will collect some questions, and then we'll have, I hope, a couple rounds of questions and comments. Please, go ahead. Please state your name and have
Tom Timberg, consultant. First, I'd like to thank you for the continuing process of demonstrating the variety of possible paths to development. But there are two things I was wondering about, and they both have to do a little bit with underlying statistical problems. In the case of China and India, we have had a lot of material about what were the Chinese called town and village enterprises, rural enterprises. They account for a very large portion, both of income and of employment in both cases. How do they fit into the picture? And the second issue is two of your countries, Botswana and Nigeria, are countries with very large, how do I say, natural resource rich sectors. And how did you deal with the figures involved with those sectors? Did you just pull them out of the figures entirely? How did you deal with it? Good, thank you.
And if you could just give us your name as well.
Tom Timberg, Timberg. I'm a consultant.
Great, thank you. Here, the mic is coming.
Thank you. I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project. I'm very interested, thank you for this, because I'm going to dive into these case studies. I'm particularly interested in the impact on inequality and mean income. So the graphs were very useful because they showed it indexed across the whole economy, but often the overall economy is growing and mean income may be growing faster or growing lower, and inequality may be growing faster or slower. And that has a huge reflection on this issue of local demand. So I'm just wondering what insights you got into how these different paths affect mean income and inequality in the societies.
And Mark, right here. Sorry.
Hi, Mark Rosegrant from IFPRI. The example the analysis showed with the, in a sense, self-defeating structural transformation is really exciting to me. I'm wondering if one of the fundamental reasons for that is that, in fact, the East Asian type manufacturing and export expansion is no longer possible, partly because global demand is not high enough, but also because to the extent that China, for example, sheds jobs in manufacturing, it'll be the Southeast Asian or South Asian countries that pick those up, and that particularly for Africa, it's almost impossible to develop a comparative advantage in those kinds of sectors that would provide you that kind of growth.
Great. And one more question. Michael, out there.
Hi, good afternoon. Michael Morris with the Agriculture Practice of the World Bank. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I'm trying to figure out the policy implications of this sort of in a general way, and particularly whether the implications of this work are somehow that policymakers should be focusing more on facilitating the sectoral movements versus driving productivity growth within sectors. Is that story somehow changing as a result of this work?
Okay. We'll leave it for you two to decide who answers what, but why don't we have a discussion of these first four comments?
Let me pick on a few of them, and the real hard ones I'll leave Maggie for Maggie to answer. I think you brought up the role of TVEs, and I think they were extremely important in China. Maybe for the first 15 years or so of the transition, it was the first stage of industrialization, if you will. It was much more rural-based industrialization, and township and village enterprises were very important in driving growth from the mid-80s to maybe about the mid-1990s. But from that point on, I think it was, with the much more outward export-oriented industrialization, I think private, more regular private enterprises, state enterprises played, and DFI in particular, foreign investment, I think, played a particular role. But I see the TVEs as really the first stage of industrialization, rapid industrialization in China. And really, it fits into that sort of process of industrialization. But I think their importance became secondary, I think, from the mid-1990s onward, I think. I'll let your question about Botswana and Nigeria, I'll let Maggie take them on. I think it was an interesting question about the inequality consequences, and I think that's extremely important and also ties in with the points that Danielle was making about, in terms of the political implications of this. Because when you think about, how the modern world was created, the role that standard industrialization route played in that. Because, manufacturing jobs weren't pleasant jobs, but they were really how the middle class came about. And because, in part, because manufacturing, all these workers together could develop something like a class consciousness in Marxian terms. So they could have organizations like unions representing them, labor-based parties representing them. And with that came a whole range of not just wage improvements, but also improvements in working conditions and sort of modern reformed capitalism and the welfare states eventually. Now, this kind of path is not one that's really generating a middle class in that quite same way, because we're really talking about, petty trade and urban services that are sort of, highly disorganized kind of a way. And so it's not only is it that in terms of the income consequences and earning consequences, it produces a much more dichotomous and much more inegalitarian system, but it also doesn't, lead to the kind of political bargains, I think, that leads to the maturation of the political systems and the kind of, democracies that we had in the advanced world. And of course, the advanced world now is sort of moving back, is looking more and more like developing countries for actually precisely the same set of effects, moving in the reverse direction. The industrialization and the rise of the gig economy and all of that are in some sense convergence to the developing country model from above. On sort of whether the Chinese path the African path is due because of the greater difficulties of industrialization in today's world. I think that's absolutely right. I think it has very little to do with African policy per se. I think there are forces that are pushing for what I've called premature deindustrialization everywhere. One of them, of course, is that manufacturing is now much more skill intensive. So that even as China, for example, is moving away from its export-oriented industrialization model, everything that it's producing now is much more skill intensive. So it's actually, bringing its supply chains back home, and even though it is investing abroad in manufacturing, it's nothing like the kind of scale you would imagine if you were to follow the same kind of labor-intensive model. And there is a sense in which, as it becomes a lot easier to with digitization and robots and 3D printing to produce standard manufacturers like shoes much more cheaply with automation and digital technologies. The countries like Ethiopia are losing their sort of comparative advantage in standard manufacturing, which was based on labor abundance and low labor costs. So I think that's a fundamental problem for these countries. The policy implications, I think, are that I think we need to think much more in terms of increasing productivity in services, much less in terms of thinking about how do we get, how to promote industries. So it's going to be much more, I think, domestically oriented, much less oriented towards world markets. And it's going to be much harder because of the nature of services that we're really talking about, as opposed to the kind of standard model of industrial policy where you just sort of pick a few winners at a time, and hopefully some of them, picking winners somebody kick me, I use that word, but you know, it's easier if you happen to land on a few winners, then there can be successful in the world markets and give you a decade until you find the next new winners. With services, you have to do them basically all at the same time, because most of them are going to be dependent on domestic income, domestic demand, and increasing productivity in a whole range of services is going to be much more. So it calls for a very different kind of, much more difficult kind of structural transformation policy, sort of a different kind of an industrial policy, but more focused on urban services.
Thank you. Just about Botswana and Nigeria. Botswana, everybody that's written about it says it hasn't fallen into the typical trap of a natural resource exporter. Its exchange rate has never been overvalued, and so on and so on. So there are political reasons set forth for the reasons why Botswana is where it is. But to me, the most interesting aspect of Botswana is that serious pocket of poverty in an area of the country that is not conducive to agriculture. And Nigeria, we did take out the oil sector. And it's interesting because if you include the oil sector, productivity growth is about at least a percentage point lower. That's just because there's not a whole lot new happening in that sector, and also there's a very small share of the labor force, very small, in oil. And I'm going to talk about rural enterprises, and Michael, I'm giving a talk next week at the World Bank, and hopefully you'll come. And the title of the talk is Strategies for Raising Labor Productivity in Sub-Saharan Africa, and not agriculture. By the way, one of the good news stories that comes out of everything that we've shown you is the increasing productivity in the agricultural sector, I think. I'm working on two different projects that tackle this raising labor productivity growth within sectors. One of them is in Ethiopia, and you know, Ethiopia might not become the next China, but some new information I got from Alan Gelb at the Center for Global Development shows that wages in Ethiopia are still extremely low. There has been a lot of foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector. The gap, we are focusing on gaps across sectors, but the gap between labor productivity in Ethiopia's manufacturing sector, even formal manufacturing, and labor productivity in manufacturing in the United States is still enormous. It's something like $60,000 per person to $2,000 per person worker. So there's huge scope for raising within sector productivity, and we focus in our research on how foreign direct investment has been able to do that, and we have some pretty remarkable results. We look at local areas, and we show that this foreign direct investment has been responsible for increases in productivity, increased entry by domestic firms, increases in wages, and increased profits. So I think it's pretty exciting. I do think Ethiopia is a special case in terms of its suitability for labor-intensive manufacturing. And then in Tanzania, so these small enterprises, Shinshen, who's in the audience, kind of pushed me towards this project, and I think it's great because it speaks to the politics, it speaks to what's going on the ground. Basically, we take this nationally representative survey of small and medium-sized enterprises, and they're in manufacturing and services, and we show that there's an enormous amount of productive heterogeneity among these small enterprises, and we show that there are a group of them that have average productivity, labor productivity, way above the economy-wide average. So what we're working on now with Jed also back there in Tanzania is we've partnered with a large commercial bank, and then this state-owned CIDO. What does it stand for again? Small Industries Development Organization. We've partnered with them, and the idea is to develop a product that's targeted to these small but very productive firms to see if there's potential for growth among those firms, and where we come in is we just are going to sort of evaluate this intervention. But I think that situation is not unique to Tanzania. It's all across the continent. So again, it's raising within sector productivity growth, what can be done along those lines.
Great, thank you. There's two people right next to each other with their hands up. Binayak?
I was actually, Professor Roderick, your student for a brief period during 2009 in Kennedy School from the senior executive course. So my question to both of you, but particularly you, where does Bangladesh fit in this model? Because Bangladesh is apparently a contrast to the case studies where manufacturing actually leading the structural change, and most of the non-agricultural employment is not created in the service sector, but in the manufacturing sector. So do you see a future of manufacturing-led structural change and employment generation in Bangladesh? And what would be the next after ready-made garments, according to your considered opinion? Thank you.
And then right next to you.
Hi, I'm Arturo Porsekansky on the faculty of American University. I was wondering if I can get you to sharpen the policy implications a bit more. For example, you have countries where the people moved from informal sector to informal sector, from agriculture into manufacturing or services. Why didn't they join the formal economy? Was it because the formal economy was hostile to new entrants? For example, there was a lot of labor regulations, taxation, onus of coming clean, therefore implications for labor market reform and opening up. Also, when you had populations moving from low productivity agriculture to low productivity services, was it because there were no national industrial champions? Some people might have read, that's what was missing. A lot of the Eastern European, East Asian, of course, they did sponsor champions at the beginning. Maybe that was the spark that was missing in some of these other countries. In some, feel free to sharpen the policy implications.
Okay, great, thank you. And there's someone back there at the last row.
Lizardo Bolaños, George Mason University. There appears to be some pessimistic perspective on the last slide from Danny Roderick regarding the future and the possibility of growth. Is it possible that taking a long-term perspective, and I'm talking about centuries here, what we're seeing is just a small episode, and we should be expecting an increase in imports coming from places like China and East Asia that could boost the possibility of African countries and Latin American countries to generate development in the future, just as it eventually happened in Western Europe and the United States as an engine for growth for other countries. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, one last here, up here at the front row. Raise your hand again. Help her out.
Hi, how are you? My name is Remy. I'm from GW. I'm also one of the authors on the study. 4 years ago, as I was working on a paper, I was also working on a different paper called Urbanization Without Industrialization. And our main theory is that countries export natural resources, like in Africa and the Middle East, which increase income, and then increase consumption, and then increase investment, and increase the demand for non-tradable services. And that's why people move to the cities, and that's why you have urbanization, but without industrialization and so on. Now, I'm very happy to see that this is a theory that, in a way, you have this investment, whether it's like public debt or, ODA or like natural resources, but you need some income, and it will increase the demand for non-tradable services, so that's why people move to the cities. Now, when we were working on this paper 4 years ago, Maggie was very skeptical about the paper and said, no, in Africa it's all about manufacturing now. It's like you have this beginning of a manufacturing revolution. So I want to ask you if 4 years later you have changed your mind, or if it is driven by this.
A question for me, okay. Good.
And in the case of Ethiopia, where is this money coming from? Because you have more public investment, but is it because the government is borrowing more money? Yeah, thank you.
Very good. So let's come back to our authors.
Well, Remy, you had a point. However, the thing is, Africa has had natural resources forever, right? And what's different now is the wealth is being spread around. So that is why I'm much more optimistic now than I ever was before. And I've been working on African countries for a long time. And so I think we can agree, and also, and I think I'm
You can say it.
Danny's a big shot, but I think I'm much more optimistic about the future of African countries and growth in those countries. I think that, you know what, economists are terrible at predicting the future. I do think, of course, it's right that labor-intensive manufacturing is more difficult now, but what Danny said about the domestic markets, I think it's really, really important, and I wish I had time to show you all the slides, all the pictures that I took in the grocery store in Tanzania of all the products produced locally. From White Dent, the toothpaste, which I now use, I import it from Tanzania, and you know, canned soft drinks, processed cashews, all these different kinds of products. That I lived there in 1990. There was nothing, nothing. So the changes are incredible. You know, where we're going down the road, I agree that labor-intensive manufacturing will be difficult, but I still think there's a lot of scope for providing these kinds of goods to domestic markets. And I don't know very much about Bangladesh, so I'm going to let Danny talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, also just to put my relative pessimism in context, I do think that low-income countries and sub-Saharan African countries can grow at quite respectable and certainly in historical terms, quite significant rates. I'm talking about growth rates of 3%, even 4% in per capita terms, which would be extremely high in historical terms, and would imply significant convergence with developed countries over the long term, especially since they're, won't be doing that well. But so I think that's entirely possible. But I guess my caution is much more on sort of the kind of growth rates we've experienced recently of 8%, 9%, even 7%, whether it's India or Ethiopia. I think these kinds of growth rates are impossible to maintain unless you have very rapid structural change. And I think our story about why those countries have had so much structural change recently, is not one that's sort of suggests a lot of sort of sustainability or something you can really push into the future indefinitely. So I'm a relative optimist in terms of, if you want to sort of moderate, and in terms of in historical terms actually quite rapid growth. I'm not sure for sub-Saharan Africa it's going to be enough to generate the kind of jobs that a very young labor force will need over the next decades. That's, I think, the biggest issue. But my worry is that many African political leaders have not adjusted their expectations and are not in the business of lowering expectations of their populations also sufficiently, if in fact these growth rates are not sustainable. And I think with respect to the question about, if you take a very, very long-term view, maybe, we will have the same kind of experience as other countries that eventually got rich. I guess my point there is look, all of that experience was based on the one sustainable, time-honored path of industrialization that all of those countries experienced. I just don't think this is going to happen anymore for reasons having to do both with technology and other reasons, like the shifts in demand patterns in the world away from goods and into services. So I just don't see that pattern of industrialization being an engine for growth anywhere in the future. I think that's sort of a picture, is something about the past. So that's I would be. So if we're going to have sustain very rapid growth in the future, it'll have to come from some kind of different kind of a model. On Bangladesh, I don't have really a lot to say. Bangladesh was very successful at making a transition into labor-intensive garments. My impression is it's sort of stuck there. It's not going much beyond that. And I haven't looked at the numbers for Bangladesh, but I'd be very surprised if, in fact, most of the growth in urban employment was still manufacturing and not, in fact, the kinds of services that we're talking about. So I think that my strong suspicion is that even in the case of Bangladesh, what we're having is this process of industrialization, manufacturing employment running out of speed, and most of the employment being generated in non-manufacturing urban services. But I would have to look. Where did the money come from for the Ethiopian public investment, for the investment boom? I think it was a combination of external transfers and one of the pictures I put up also showed that the government was very good at shifting from public consumption to public investment. So public consumption actually fell while public investment rose. And then, the Ethiopians have, because they haven't listened to sustained World Bank, IMF pressure for the longest time, they have this wonderful mechanism of financial repression, which they, generate resources for the public sector. So they have, so that seems to be how they essentially pay for public investment. Finally, the question about sort of why aren't the, formal firms expanding? I mean, that's, you can imagine a very long list of reasons. It can be government regulations. It could be, market failures, externalities, that government, firms are not internalizing the full social benefits of their increasing capacity. It could be, relatively high wages. It could be credit market constraints. It could be a whole range of things. I think what we should guard against is the view that there is only sort of one silver bullet, that in each one of these cases it's just poor regulations, too much red tape, corruption, or poor property rights. I think these things are highly context specific, and I think when I was talking about earlier about a different kind of industrial policy targeted at the needs of urban services and increasing productivity, precisely of the kinds of these middle kinds of firms that Maggie was talking about that already have reasonably good productivity. The question is sort of figuring out exactly what the constraints for those kinds of firms are, so that they can be 5 times, 6 times, 10 times as large as they could be. One final point I would say, again, because there were a couple of points about employment, about policy implications, that I think a lot of discussion about, in particular in the context of whether you call it industrial policy, you call it productive development policy, you call it structural transformation policy, a lot of that discussion misses is that when you're looking at what you want to achieve, employment growth in those relatively high productivity activities has to be at the top. I think most government officials instead, when they're thinking about industrial policy or structural transformation policy, they're thinking about innovation. They think about R&D. They're thinking about exports. They think about investment. I think you really have to look at this from the perspective of will these firms, do they have the capacity to generate employment, and how can you get them to increase employment? Because I think that's going to be the key issue, both from the standpoint of equality and all the other political consequences, but also in terms of getting people. Ultimately, it's the people who matter, from low productivity, low paying jobs to the higher productivity ones. And the challenge there is really employment. It's not R&D, innovation, exports, and those kinds of things that we typically get hung up on.
I think we've had an excellent set of questions and a great discussion. I would keep this going, but we're supposed to end now, and you don't have to leave. You can try to keep Danny and Maggie from leaving, and you just keep asking them questions, and maybe they'll stay. I don't know. But let's thank them for their presentation.